In the first lesson, we explored the dashboard and discussed how to stay organized, among a few other things. Now, let's dive in and start creating some graphics. Here in the dashboard, we'll right-click to create a new folder, and we'll call it Academy. Then we can double-click to open it up, and again, right-click, create a new composition, and we'll name this Simple Graphics. Important note, stay organized. Now we can double-click to open it up, and this is the Composer user interface. On the left, we have the composition tree where all layers live, including groups, widgets, and subcompositions. You can easily add these using the toolbar at the top, which contains the most common ones, or by clicking the Add button. We can control properties of layers within each of these tabs. These properties can be linked to control nodes located at the bottom right, which allow you to dynamically update text, images, and other elements during live streams. As we build our graphics, we'll be able to see how they look in the preview window. Remember, Singular works in the cloud, so it's browser-based, which means there can be some anomalies from time to time. So if you notice anything unusual or experience odd behavior in the Composer, try refreshing the page, and most of the time that should fix the issue. One last thing before we continue, we recommend using Google Chrome for best performance and stability. Before we start designing, it's important to know that we can actually set the dimensions of our composition. So right now it's using 1080p Full HD, but we can choose between different presets here or even set a custom resolution. So let's say 1080 by 1920, which will give us a vertical format. So this would be great if you want to design graphics for vertical live streams. But anyway, we'll go back to Full HD 1080p. And the first time we create a new composition, we'll already have a subcomp in here, which we can rename by hitting return, and we'll call it L3, short for lower third. As I renamed that, you might have noticed that it auto-saved the file. Well, you can actually disable it and choose to save it manually or hit the Ctrl+S shortcut, but I like to keep that on at all times. This way it will automatically save in the background with each action. Speaking of saving, there's even a revisions feature in Singular, which allows us to create save points of our project. So let's type in 1, hit create, and now we can continue working. This is very useful for iterating, or if say you made a mistake and now want to go back to a previous save point. We can go inside of this subcomposition by hitting this arrow, or by using the left and right arrow keys to go in and out of subcomps, or up and down arrow keys to cycle through the list of layers. And up top here, we can see where we are in the subcomposition chain. Now you'll notice that we already have a group present inside of this subcomp, but we can go ahead and click the rectangle widget at the top. Now we could size down the rectangle itself, but it's actually better practice to resize the group instead. And you'll see why a bit later, but let's just select the group and size this down. In fact, let me type in 50. We can disable the constraints and say set the Y size to 20%. The values here are relative to the composition size. So currently, the Y size of this group is 20% of the total composition height. Then we'll click and drag on the Y position. Let's also round this down to 30%. Now, quick tip is to always use whole numbers. So that means 30, 31, 32, instead of using 32.3, or even if you hold down Control, you can actually go up and down in 0.1 increments, but this will give you a lot of headaches later down the line. So again, I would try to stick to whole numbers or at least 0.5 increments. But for this, we'll just type in 30%. Now, I want to split this box in two parts, so we'll hit return, we'll name this one top box, hit Ctrl+D to duplicate, and the bottom one we'll call bottom box. Now we can toggle the bounding box overlay, which will give us this blue outline, as well as this dot in the middle, which represents the anchor point. And I'll set this at the bottom because what I want to do is set the Y size of the bottom box to 50%. And as I said before, the position and size of layers is always relative to their parent or to the composition as a whole. So if we set the Y size of the bottom box to 50%, that means it's half the size of the group. Now we'll do the same for the top one. So we'll select it. This time we'll set the anchor point at the top, disable the constraints, and let's set the Y size to 50%. Now, if we disable the bounding box, it looks as if we didn't change anything, but really what we did was split that box in two. Now with the rectangle widget selected, we have this additional tab, as we do with most widgets in Singular. And there's usually this question mark right next to it, where you can click and it will take you to the article of that widget in the support portal of Singular. And here we can change properties such as the fill color. So let's choose a bright blue. And then for the bottom box, we'll do sort of a darker blue, less saturated, something like that. And I'm doing this because I actually want another box, which I'll call image box. And we'll make this one completely white. Then we'll go back to the transform and we'll set the Y size to 100%. Then let's toggle the bounding box again. We'll set the anchor point to the left of it. And then we can simply drag on the X size. So it'll size down from the left side. And let's say type in 24. That looks kind of like a square. We don't have to be perfect. Now let's start adding some text by clicking on the text widget. We'll call this title. Now instead of trying to set up the dimensions, the size to match with the boxes, we can actually go over to the top box, hit Ctrl+C, which will copy not only the layer, but also its properties. So if we hit Ctrl+V, it's the same as hitting Ctrl+D to duplicate. We're just pasting the same layer, but we can delete that and select the title. You'll see this clipboard icon on pretty much every property. And for example, we can choose to paste the size, position, and anchor point of the layer we copy the properties from. And now you'll see that the title and the top box are sitting pretty much in the exact same spot. Now we currently can't see it because it's sitting behind the image box. And granted, it's also white. So let me set it to black and we'll just move it a bit to the side. But I'm actually gonna reset this and we'll hide it just for now. We'll go over to the image box, look at the X size, it's currently 24%. So 100% minus 24, that would be 76. Now before we change any values, I wanna set the anchor point to the right here. So when we size this down, it actually sizes down from the right. And then we'll do the same for the bottom box. So now the top and bottom boxes and the image boxes together make up 100% and they don't overlap. Now again, we can hit Ctrl+C on the top box to copy its properties, go back to the title and simply paste these properties and it will perfectly move to that spot. Now I still want to have a bit of a gap here, so we can push it slightly to the left, maybe by 3%. Now I'll go over to the text tab and I'll just type in a bunch of letters. And you'll see that as soon as that bounding box is filled, the text then starts to get stretched. And that's got to do with the way the overflow is currently being handled. So we can actually switch to letter size, which will size down the entire text to keep it within the bounding box. Now it's being sized down from the base, so we can change the vertical alignment to middle. And of course, I want this to be cut off just a bit before the top box ends. And I also want the same amount of negative space on the right as we have on the left. So let's set the anchor point to the left and then we'll size it down. Something like that, maybe 70%. Now we can go over to the text. Let's type in Singular.live and we'll choose a different font. We'll set the weight to bold and use a white color. Now let's duplicate the title, call it subtitle, and we'll rearrange these a little bit. Then we'll copy the bottom box and paste the properties on the subtitle. Now we do have to make some modifications just as before. So with the anchor point set to the left, we'll set the X position to 27 and the X size to 70. Then we'll go over to the text properties. We can choose the medium weight for some contrast. And here we can type in cloud-based live graphics. Now there's one last detail I want to touch on before we move on to adding an image. So with the title, as of now, we're not using enough letters to fill up that bounding box. So the size of this title is pretty much 100%. But what if I want to have additional negative space on the top and bottom? Well, for one, we could size it down on the y-axis, but that's messing with the bounding box, and I don't want it. So we'll go back to 50%, and instead we'll use the line height value. So the custom line height value doesn't do anything, but we can choose the custom option here, and now it will work. So let's say set it to about 150%. So you'll see that the bounding box is staying the same, but the text itself is sizing down. And we'll actually do the same with the subtitle. We'll set this to custom 150%. So even if we don't type in enough letters to fill up the bounding box, there will still be some negative space at the top and bottom, and also at the left and the right side. Now let's create an image widget. We'll move it at the top. And the first option we have is to choose an image from the dashboard. Now, granted, we don't have anything imported yet, so we'll right click, create a new folder. We'll call it assets. Then we'll go inside, and I'll click and drag a couple of Singular icons from my desktop. One is 640 by 640, and the other is 1024 by 1024. And I brought both of these in because I wanted to remind you to always use as small file sizes as possible, depending on your use case. So in this case, because we're designing a lower third, usually the lower thirds will be smaller in the screen, so we can get away with fewer pixels. But that in turn means that the size of that image will not be as big as well, because we're generating web pages, and the larger the file sizes, the longer it will take for those to load. Now, to have this logo fit perfectly within the image box, again, we'll hit Ctrl+C and then go over to the transform on the image, paste the size and everything else. Now, on the image tab, you have a few other options, so you can maybe flip the logo horizontally or vertically. And then depending on the object fit type, you can shift the image around to the left, to the right. And sure, it is recommended to use images that you've imported in your dashboard, but in this box, you can even input the URL of an image available online. So here on the Singular website, we can right click, open image in new tab, and then right click here, copy image address, and paste that over here. Now you can't see it because the text itself is white, so let's just choose another color. And there's the logo. But only use online images at your own risk because, of course, those can be deleted unless you're using images from your own web server. But we can go ahead and undo by clicking this button or using Ctrl+Z as a shortcut. I think this is a good point to even create a new revision, so we'll type in 2 and hit create. Now, if we made a mistake and we want to go back, we can simply load up this first revision. But let's go back and continue. Now let's start animating by moving over to the animation tab. You can either animate individual layers or groups as a whole. By default, every layer will have a half-a-second fade animation, but we can disable those by clicking on the settings button and hitting none. And then for the group, we can set the animation type to translate, which means to move. And then we can keep accessing those animation settings here or at the bottom over here. These correspond to the animation settings of the selected layer. So we can use the up and down arrow keys to cycle between the layers and then change their animation settings down here. Now the second option is to choose where we want this to move in from. So from down. Now we can hit spacebar to preview that animation. So let's say half a second. And we can even set the easing. So let's say use a power of 2. In fact, let me go back to 1 second by hitting R to reset that value. And I think that looks a bit smoother. Now, I also want the titles and the image to animate in, so we can Ctrl+C to copy this layer's properties and then paste that animation over here, as well as on the title and the subtitle. And right away, there's already a bit of offset, but we can choose to offset the title by 1 grid and the subtitle by 2 grids. Now, the reason these are snapping to the grid is because we have this option enabled, but we can choose to disable it so we can now freely move it around. And let's say something like that. Maybe this should offset a bit more. And you can see that most of the time it's just a trial and error. You move things around, you hit space to preview how it looks. You can even zoom the timeline in and out and scrub the playhead manually. But you'll notice that as we scrub this playhead, these elements are showing up outside the bounding box of the group. To fix this, we can select the group, go over to the Effect tab, and clip the children. Now you'll see that when we preview the animation, everything is masked inside of the group. Another type of animation I want to look at is under the Behavior tab. So we can add a scale behavior, and this will make it so the subtitle will oscillate between 2 values. And we can choose the effect here, so let's say loop plus, it will go from the minimum to the maximum value and then loop back, or vice versa. But let's switch this back to ping pong, and let's say set a maximum value of 100% and then the minimum to 90. so the sizing is very subtle. Then we can set the duration, so how long it takes to go from minimum to the maximum value. Then we can set a delay, so for example, it can hold for 2 seconds after it reaches either the minimum or the maximum value, and then goes back to the other. Let me reset that, and we even have easing controls. So let's go power of 3 just to really make that noticeable. Maybe even use 80% and even duration of 1 second. And I'll head back to the text tab and I'll just type in subscribe. So behavior animations can be very useful whenever you need a graphic to call to an action. But for now, we'll go ahead and disable this just so it's not distracting. Now I want to go back to the point I made earlier on sizing children layers relative to the parent group. And that comes into play now. So if we change the X value on the group, or even the Y value, you'll see that everything is resizing dynamically. Now let me go back to 50 by 20. We'll lock the proportions and let's say set the size to 35. And we can even push this lower down, so 35%. It's a lower third after all. And then if we move back to the root level, we can rename this to L3 small, duplicate it, and we'll do L3 big. We'll hide the other one, go back inside, and let's just size this up back to maybe 45. And then we'll unlock the proportions and then even size it up on the X, maybe 65%. So now we have two different versions of this lower third. One is bigger, one is smaller. Now, if we click in or out over here, you'll see that nothing is happening. And that's because these buttons trigger the in and out animation of the subcomposition we are currently in. That means if we go inside of the big one and then click these buttons, you'll see it coming in and out. But that's a bit tedious because we have to go back to the small one, go inside of here, and then preview its animation. So instead, we can bring up the composition navigator with this button or by using the Control F shortcut. And that allows us to not only preview the in and out animation of these subcomps, but also very quickly navigate between them. And you can tell by looking up top at the composition chain. Another reason we have two lower thirds is logic layers. So if we click on this button and create a new layer, we'll call it bottom, and then add the L3 small to the bottom logic layer as well, Singular will then automatically take out one graphic before it brings up the other one if they are part of the same logic layer. But by default, it triggers the animation at the same time, but we can actually go over to the transition delay and choose auto. And this means it will wait for one of the graphics to first go out before bringing the other one in. Now we can even set a custom delay, say 1 second on both of them, which means it will go out, wait a second, bring the other one back in. And in fact, we can even go on the negative, so they will overlap by 1 second. But let me switch this back to auto and we're good to go. So this way, during our live shows, we don't have to worry about bringing one lower third out before we can bring the other one in. Singular will do that for us. Now let's create a third revision and move over to the control nodes panel. One thing to keep in mind is that properties of layers can only be connected to control nodes in the subcomp or to control nodes of the parent subcomp. And that's important to know in cases like this where we have multiple variations of lower thirds, so we don't end up doing double the work. Now, just to quickly demonstrate, I'll go ahead and create a new text control node. We'll call this title, hit add, and head over to the title, go over to the text property, and you'll see that the text value here is underlined, which means this can be connected to a control node. In fact, every underlined value can be connected to a control node. So we can click on this and then choose the title control node. So now those two are linked. We can't edit the text over here. We have to edit it down here. And whatever we set up in the control nodes panel is what will be available for us to control in real time with control applications. Another way to quickly create these control nodes is by clicking on the underlined property and directly adding it. So that will create a control node as well as connect it. Now, the downside to creating a control node directly from the property is that you can't choose what the type of the control node is. So say you're creating a scoreboard where you want to be able to quickly add +1 or -1 to a number. Well, the text type isn't really suited for that. So we can go ahead and delete this control node, and instead we'll use a counter control node. So we'll call this score, hit add, and we'll link this up. And here we can either type in the number or use these preset buttons. And these preset buttons can be set over here. So we can choose to show as many of these set buttons as we want. Think of these as resetting a number to a specific value. So here, this is set to 3, but we can actually change this to 5. And now when we hit here, it will set that value to 5. And then we have modify buttons, which are to the right. So these are used for either adding or subtracting values. So if you're creating a scoreboard for a basketball, for example, you may want to have a 3-point. So then you can quickly add 3 points to this number. Now I'll go ahead and delete both of these. First of all, because this was only for demonstration, but also because we have 2 lower thirds, practically the same with just different sizes, we don't want to set up these control nodes independently in each of these subcompositions. Instead, we want to go back to the root level and create control nodes over here, because remember, we can actually connect properties of layers inside of subcompositions to control nodes in the parent subcomposition, in this case, the root level. So we'll start with a title, hit add. We can actually duplicate it by clicking this icon or by hitting Ctrl D as a shortcut. The second one we'll call subtitle. Then we'll need an image control node, and we'll call this image, hit add. We can also organize these a little bit by moving this up at the top of the stack. And to keep things even more neat, we can create a node container, and we'll call this lower third, hit add, and then just drag these inside of this container. So this can now be collapsed. We can set the width to small. We can even give this a tooltip. So these are the lower third controls. And we can read that by hovering over this tooltip. And this would come in handy for graphics operators. Now I want a few color control nodes for these boxes as well. So let's switch over to the color type. We'll call it top box, hit add, bring it inside. Then we can duplicate it, rename this to bottom box, duplicate it one more time, and we'll call this image box. Now there is another way we can keep these more organized, and that's by adding an info control node, which by itself doesn't do anything. So if I name it colors and bring it just over the color control nodes here, it only serves for visual clarity. So you'll see here that you can even include HTML tags. So this is the bold open tag, and this is where you close it. And whatever you type inside will be in bold weight. So let's just call this colors, and we'll delete the rest of the text. But now we have 2 color texts showing up. So if we go over to the advanced panel here, we can hide the title of this control node. So that's the ID. So now we are only seeing what is inside of this box. So we have everything neatly organized inside of this one node container, and now it's time to connect them. So we'll start by bringing up the composition navigator. We'll go inside of the L3 small, and I'll start with the image widget. So click on the image property, and here we have to actually switch to the root level and then choose the image control node. Then we'll do the title next. So choose root, title control node, and then we'll do the subtitle. And once we have everything set up, we can go back to the root level, change any of these control nodes, and then switch between these 2 lower thirds. And you'll see that both of them are showing the exact same titles. And in fact, I can even change the colors, and it's going to affect the color of the top box from the other lower third. Now I kind of messed up the colors of that lower third, so we can use this ColorZilla extension on the Chrome browser, add it to Chrome, and once it's installed, we can pin it to the extensions bar, click on it to activate it, and then click on whatever color you want to pick from the screen, which will copy that color to the clipboard and paste it over to the top box control node. And don't forget, we can even change the image here, so I'll go ahead and import the Uno logo. And Overlays.Uno is Singular's child company that offers 100% free live graphics. And we can even pick the color again and paste it over here. Now, I am noticing that the Uno logo is a bit too large. There's not a lot of negative space around it. So we could go ahead and create a number control node, and we'll call this image size, hit add, bring it just before, and we'll go inside the L3 small, Then we'll lock the constraint and hook up the Y value to the root control node that is image size. Now it is showing 0% here, so we need to go back and set this back to 100. But now because those two values are linked, when we now move this up and down, it's gonna size it down proportionally. So now we have control over the image size as well. Don't forget, we also need to link the image Y size of the big lower third. So let's bring that one in. And if we switch back to the Singular logo, we can maybe choose to resize it back up. If we hit R, we can reset the value. And you can see that the reset value on the image size is set to 0. In fact, I want to set this to 100. So whenever the operator in the control application hits R, the value will resize to 100. And you can even change the step. So now you can only size this up and down in increments of 1. And if you hold down Control in this case, it will only allow you to cycle that value in finer increments. There's even a unit here, so maybe Shift 5 to type in a percentage. So this is only visual, it doesn't really do anything else. But we can set a minimum and maximum value, so now you can't drag this past 100% in case you want to limit that. And even show a slider for easier control. Now, as we've been modifying these properties, the change is instant, meaning there is no fade in or some sort of other animation going on. Well, we can change that by tweaking the update animations. So if we move into the L3 small, head over to the update tab and activate it, by default we'll have a fade in and fade out animation of 0.5 seconds. So now if we go back to the control nodes and change this, you'll see the text fades out before it fades back in. So when the graphics operator makes a change to the title or image or what have you during a live broadcast, it doesn't just abruptly change, but there's a bit of an animation going on as well. Now I've gone ahead and added a fade animation to all the other layers except for the image. For this, I actually want to add a translate animation. So on the out, we want to say which way does it go when it moves out. So we want it to go up. And then when it comes in, we want it to come in from the bottom, so down. Now we can toggle the bounding box because this is very important. The translation update animation takes into consideration the bounding box of the layer. And when we go back to the root level, let's choose the Uno logo. And you saw how that moved up and then came back in from the bottom. And the way that was getting cut off was based on the bounding box. So if I size this down, let's toggle the bounding box here, and you'll see how that's sized down now. And we'll move back and change over to the Singular logo. The cutoff point was the bounding box and not the mask of the group itself. Anyway, we'll reset this back to 100%, and we'll change this to, say, Singular.live. Finally, we'll spice things up with some audio by using the sound widget. Over the sound tab, we can add a file that we need to choose, of course, from our dashboard. So I'll click and drag and import one, and then double click to open it up. Then we can decide on when this audio plays. So either during the in animation, the out, in and out, or set it to loop in case you're using some music. Now we can set this to in and out, but I actually prefer to only use the in option when it comes to live graphics, and I'll even lower the volume by 50% just so this graphic isn't intrusive. So it grabs the viewer's attention when it comes in, but then quietly goes away. The purpose of these graphics is to improve the viewer's experience and not to serve as a distraction. In the next two lessons, we'll take a look at how we can control these graphics in real time with the Studio and Uno control applications. We will also go through the process of bringing the output URL of those control apps in live streaming software such as OBS and vMix. With that, I will see you in the next lesson.